Hi, welcome to First State Heritage Park, located right in the historic downtown district of Dover, Delaware. My name is Ryan Schwartz. I'm the Interpretive Programs Manager for First State Heritage Park and for Delaware State Parks. Now, for visitors of First State Heritage Park, if you look behind me, you'll recognize our Interpretive Center, known as the John Bell House, located at 43 The Green. It's an unassuming little structure, but it has a story whose significance belies its small size. Today we're going to spend a little bit of time exploring that story together and giving you a glimpse behind the scenes at some of the features that you can't see on any public tour. And you can do it all from the comfort of your own home. Now, if you just look at the building itself, it really doesn't look like much. It's only 16 feet by 25 feet in its footprint. But even though it's a very small structure, its impact and status within the history of Delaware is much, much larger. This is a great example of first period Delaware and Chesapeake architecture. It's the oldest wooden framed timber structure here in Dover. It also was probably built as a workshop, and that magnifies its significance. Being built as a workshop, those kind of structures really don't tend to survive. And as far as we can tell, this is one of very few surviving 1700s workshops within the country, and it's certainly the only one surviving here in Delaware. And it's pretty fitting that this particular structure sits here in the capital city. Dover celebrated its 300th anniversary in the year 2017. Now, originally the building had been laid out by the great proprietor himself, William Penn of Pennsylvania. After all, Delaware had been a part of Pennsylvania from its founding all the way up until 1776. So the city was laid out in 1683. But, cities don't happen overnight. And so it took until 1717 for the city itself actually to be laid out. Hence, its 300th anniversary just 3 years ago. The city of Dover was laid out according to William Penn's personal preferences. He liked all of his towns and cities to be laid out on a well-organized grid. And that grid would then be designed around common spaces. And that's how we get this one, the one that we're right across from right now, the Dover Green. Though, of course, at the time, the Dover Green was less than green because most of the trees that you're seeing were actually added during the 1800s. It was a wide open space that was designed for trade and commerce, often referred to as either the courthouse square or the public square. And by fronting onto that square, the John Bell House was a primo piece of property. That piece of property was originally sold in a 2-acre chunk in 1727 to a man named John Bell. Now, John Bell was a mariner, a sailor originally from Philadelphia, who left his life at sea to operate a tavern right next door to what is today the John Bell House property. Today, that's the Kent County Courthouse. But originally a tavern stood on that location, called the Tavern at the Sign of the King George. Now, he operated that tavern for just 2 years before passing away in 1729. And when he passed away, the tavern fell into the keeping of not his son, but his wife, Margaret Bell. Now, for a lot of people, the concept of a woman operating a tavern during the 1700s is kind of a foreign idea, because there was the traditional sense that a woman's role was domestic, to be working within the home. But a tavern in this time period was seen as a nice compromise. It included work that would be done in the home and also kept a woman, especially a widow like Margaret Bell, off of the public dole. And so she operated the tavern faithfully for some time until she passed it to her son, who was named for his father. So we're going to call him John Bell II. John Bell II took over the tavern in 1763, and it's during his tenure of tavern keeping that we believe that this John Bell House was actually constructed. For you see, John Bell II had a son who was also named John Bell. That's the third for those of you who are keeping track at home. Now, John Bell III made his living as a hatter, making headwear, which at this time period, if you walked down the streets of Dover without a hat on your head, it would have been considered highly improper. So it was a fairly profitable trade. In order to start his son out right, John Bell II built the building behind us today that we call the John Bell House, not as a home, but as a workshop. And so we can't exactly place when that workshop was constructed because there's no hard and firm date that we found in the historical record. But we've tentatively placed the construction between that year he took over in 1763 and in 1772, when this building is explicitly mentioned in an advertisement that John Bell II put into a local paper. And what does that mean? That means if this structure was built by 1772, it was witness to most of the important historical events that happened here in Dover during the American Revolution. Troops mustered right here on the green to go off and fight in the war. The Declaration of Independence was read for the first time just down the way over here. And of course, directly across from us at the Golden Fleece Tavern, the US Constitution was ratified. Delaware, of course, being the very first state to ratify the Constitution, earning its most famous nickname today. In 1793, the building fell out of the ownership of the Bell family, and it began to trade hands and uses fairly rapidly. For example, in 1824, there was a local story that this structure was used as both a post office and a print shop, but we couldn't confirm that for the longest time until 2010. In 2010, the Delaware State Parks Historical Resources Unit hosted an archaeological survey of the rear yard. And during that survey, they found an almost pristine example of printer's type, proving definitively that that piece of local lore is actual fact. During that decade of the 1820s, in reality, this building was the center of a small hub of trade buildings, including a brickmaker, a woodworker, a free black barber named Samson Darling worked right next door, and next door to him was a candy shop run by a widow named Hilford. The building itself is also a survivor. In 1863, an immense fire consumed the hotel right next door that the Tavern had turned into. But through perseverance and a proliferation of water, according to one local newspaper, the building itself was preserved and became for the first time a law office, the law office of Nathaniel Smithers, one of Abraham Lincoln's chief supporters here in Delaware. And that began its final phase, going back and forth through the late 1800s and through the early 1900s, becoming at one time a residence, at another time a law office, and then back again. Now, as was the case with most old buildings, the John Bell House saw changes over time to adapt to its many owners, and the last major changes happened during the 1930s when two large additions were placed onto the rear of the structure to accommodate its use as a residence. Now, eventually, the time came that the structure fell into disrepair. It was in bad shape, and that's when the state of Delaware stepped in. The year was 2005. When the state purchased it from the last private owners with the intent of restoring this historic piece of Delaware architecture as the centerpiece for, at that time, its newest state park, First State Heritage Park. And when the state made the acquisition, the building was in sadly deteriorated shape, primarily due to age and significant termite damage. Most noticeably, there was a 7.5-inch sag in this front part of the roof facing out onto the green. It was clear that immediate action was needed. So the Delaware State Park system moved very quickly to stabilize the structure and then undertook a full 5 years of surveying, documenting, and researching the structure, working with architects, historians, and historical preservationists to make sure that we did as thorough a job as possible. And it was through their hard work that we determined a lot of the structure's actual history, including giving us a first glimpse of what this building probably originally looked like. It was thanks to all this research and documentation that a decision was made. Instead of attempting to restore the John Bell House back to what it might have looked like when it was first built in the middle 1700s, we would instead try to preserve as much of the historical character of the structure as we possibly could. In essence, we would try to make it a representation of what this building truly was. A structure that, through its many years, became many different things for many different people. Most of the time when a historic structure is being fixed up, they usually tend to call it a restoration. But technically what we did with the John Bell House was preservation, essentially trying to make sure that every bit of historic material was preserved that we could. And rehabilitation, recognizing that this old building is going to be put to a new purpose. It's going to be an interpretive center, not an office, a home, or a workshop now. And so we were allowed to make certain vital changes, like adding in an HVAC system that people in the 1700s could only wish that they had. What that makes this building is a representation of all the eras that it survived. For example, if we look at the building today, we reduced it to its original 1700s footprint, but we kept in the doors and the windows that were added in the 1700s, and we added in an accessible entrance so that we can welcome all of our guests here to the Interpretive Center at First State Heritage Park. As they set to work, the parks team did their best to make sure that every piece of reusable material was saved, especially the lumber. On the inside of the structure, we actually left a wall exposed that you could see the original hand-riven studs that date back to the 1700s. Meanwhile, throughout the structure, there were 22 panes of glass that are still in there dating back to the 1800s. And the rest of the glass was replicated as authentically as we possibly could. And just because some material couldn't be saved doesn't mean that Delaware State Park stinted on making sure that this building came to be as accurate as it possibly could be. The shingling on the roof. The cedar shingles that were originally placed there had, of course, fallen away throughout the years. But the cedar shingles that are up there today were created by hand by craftspeople at Colonial Williamsburg and installed by our work team. The oak siding of the structure came from upstate New York. On the east and west side, we're going to feature the siding as it would have appeared during the 1700s, hand-riven oak. On the north and south side, most prominently the side that's facing the green, you're going to see oak siding a little bit larger as it would have appeared here in Dover during the 1800s. As you step into the main level of the building and look down at the floor, you will see wood that was reclaimed from a 1700s mill from Massachusetts that was then repurposed to floor our structure here in Mid-Atlantic, Delaware. Here we are inside the main level of the John Bell House, the part that most people who come here for a tour tend to see. This is the public space, but as I mentioned to you before, there are components of this building that were uncovered during the work that we did on it from 2010 to 2015. Elements that aren't typically accessible to the public that we want to show you here today. Beneath our feet is a basement, hand dug in the 1700s and walled with brick. Even though it looks like a dim space today, it was a functional space back during the 1700s. If you look back into this corner, you'll notice that there is a bricked up space that we believe once housed this structure's hearth. It was later replaced in the 1800s by the fireplace and mantel that you can see on the main floor today. Meanwhile, upstairs, up a slightly narrow and winding stair, we come up to the second level. Now, back then, this was just a half level, perhaps used at one time or other as a small bedroom or a sleeping space. That was a common use for lofts during the 1700s and 1800s. Today, we use this as one of our office spaces where our hardworking interpreters sit while they're on the job and do their research. But up here, there's two interesting features that you can't really see on a day-to-day basis. First of all, when you're on the main floor, all you can do is get a glimpse of the original flooring through a slot in the ceiling. But up here, you can see the original 1700s floorboards. Every piece that could be saved is right here. Meanwhile, behind a small little door is one of the most interesting discoveries that the team found during the restoration preservation process. That is this little beam. And inside this nondescript looking beam is punched a small anchor and the date 1743. Now, we think that the building was constructed between 1763 and 1772, but it is possible, as this beam might suggest, that it was built earlier. Or it could be that the wood that was used to build this structure was repurposed from a different building that had been built earlier, which is not uncommon in that time period. But either way, the survival of this date is an interesting link from us today to the craftsmen that built this long-enduring structure back in the midpoint of the 18th century. We look forward to welcoming you back to First State Heritage Park in the future and writing with you the next chapter of this historic structure's story. In the meantime, please like and follow us on Facebook for more stories from the First State.